Okay, moving on to the Build Back Better plan. Is the president going to stop saying that the Build Back Better plan does not increase the deficit 1 single cent if we now know that that is not true?
It is true, and I would note the several economists and experts out there. I think you're probably talking about the CBO score,
which Joe Biden himself in 2010 called the gold standard for Democrats and Republicans.
Well, Peter, since we're all here to communicate with the public about accurate information, what I would just note is that one of the components that experts, Democrats and Republicans, including former heads of the CBO, have pointed to is that IRS enforcement is not something that there's a lot of experience in the CBO scoring. They still scored it, but is undervalued by the assessment of many economists and experts, including people who have been critical of us in the past, who estimate, including former Treasury secretaries of both parties, who estimate there will be significant savings, significantly higher than what is estimated currently. So our assessment and the assessment by many economists out there is that there will be savings over 10 years that will actually reduce the deficit.
Good on Jen Psaki for unequivocally and clearly pushing back on what's certain to be the new Fox News position as Democrats push forward with the Build Back Better Act, which is that the bill is going to add to the deficit because, miraculously, the party that added $7.8 trillion to the debt has yet again become deficit hawks now that a Democrat's in office. Convenient, huh? Now, just so we're clear, the CBO scored the bill as costing $367 billion. The CBO also estimated revenues of $127 billion from IRS tax enforcement, which would mean that the bill would add about $200 billion to the deficit over 10 years. However, because the CBO is known to underestimate the impacts from tax enforcement, the Treasury Department also offered an estimate for revenues for tax enforcement that are believed to be more accurate, and that number came to $480 billion, which would mean that there would be a net reduction in the deficit of $113 billion over 10 years, meaning that yes, the bill would pay for itself and then some. And of course, when given the choice, Republicans opt to defer to the CBO score, even though it's well known that the CBO doesn't have experience scoring IRS enforcement, and that when they do, it's undervalued, which is why the Treasury Department scored the same bill, and their score compensates for what we know is too low of a value coming from the CBO. So I get that Republicans want to cherry pick whatever number will benefit their narrative, but they're doing so knowing full well the CBO's track record on tax enforcement. But just for fun, let's defer to the CBO's estimate, which again is too low, and say that the Build Back Better Act does increase the deficit by $200 billion over 10 years. That is $20 billion a year, which is a rounding error for the bloated defense budget of over $700 billion a year. So every Republican, and to be fair, many Democrats, will blindly and gleefully vote for a defense budget that's more than the next 12 countries combined, 10 of which are allies, and yet the moment we try to get universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds, or affordable childcare, or lower insulin prices, well, we couldn't possibly do that because let's not forget the deficit. Got it. And yet they can't actually say that because even the Republicans know that the components of this bill are popular. That's why they have no choice but to lob some desperate attacks like claiming that it'll grow the deficit. Aside from being inaccurate, it also fails to address the actual bill, and that's on purpose. Because what are they going to attack? Hearing aids for seniors, which Americans support 75 to 16, housing investments, which Americans support 66 to 26, clean energy jobs, which Americans support 63 to 29, childcare, which Americans support 63 to 28, universal pre-K, which Americans support 63 to 29, education subsidies, ACA subsidies, the extension of the child tax credit. Everything in this bill is too popular to attack. And so instead, Republicans have no choice but to desperately pivot to the deficit, which is not only tired, but we all know is bullshit considering the last major Republican piece of legislation that they all voted for was a tax cut in 2017 that the CBO itself estimated would add $1.4 trillion to the debt. This is about one thing: opposing Democrats. It doesn't matter how much these provisions will help Americans, including Republicans. It doesn't matter how popular the provisions are. It doesn't matter how much they'll spur growth and prosperity across the country. The point is the opposition, because as far as Republicans are concerned, hurting Democrats is more important than helping Americans. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.